This is True Criminals.
Please note this podcast discusses real-life crimes and may include sensitive topics such as violence, abuse, and other disturbing content. We recommend listener discretion.
We had use of this ultra high-tech control room in London, which is normally used for terrorism and kidnaps and things. And we were there until something more important happened, and then we'd have got kicked out. That was the problem. And there's a wonderful story about that, where I'm standing there one night looking and nothing's happening. After he got caught, chased and wasn't caught, nothing happened for 2 weeks. And it's about 10 days into that, and I'm standing drinking coffee looking up at these screens. We've got about 18 screens of CCTV that we're looking at, and radios and everything's going on. And this chief superintendent came over and said, "How long are we going to do this for, Colin?" And I said, "Till somebody's got the balls to call it off the night before an old lady gets murdered." And he said, walked away and never saw him again.
I'm journalist Helen Fospero.
I'm crime reporter Martin Brunt.
And this is True Criminals.
A journey into the darkest corners of the criminal underworld with insights from decades of true crime reporting.
The stories behind the stories, plus exclusive interviews with those closely involved in notorious cases.
Re-examining crimes so shocking, they still haunt our imaginations.
Police believed he was responsible for 203 crimes in southeast London over 17 years, breaking and entering, stealing and raping his victims, vulnerable elderly men and women. In part one, we explored the crimes of the Night Stalker, Delroy Grant, convicted in 2011 of 29 offences and jailed for 27 years. This was also a story of missed chances, including a major blunder in 1999, a case that became a kind of test of modern policing, huge forensic effort, massive suspect lists, and still the offender stayed unnamed for years.
In this episode, the point where the story turns and how the Night Stalker was caught by a change in strategy. Our guest is retired Detective Chief Inspector Colin Sutton, who was brought in to review Operation Minstead in 2009, and he turned the investigation around. He later wrote a book about his experience, Manhunt, the Night Stalker, and the case was dramatised for television. He'll talk to us about what it was like inside the investigation, how Delroy Grant was brought finally to justice.
Martin, before we bring Colin into the conversation, give us a quick recap and why this story became such a big and important one.
Helen, it stands out really because there were so many victims over so many years. But also they were the kind of victims that very rarely get media attention, the kind of attention that other victims of crime attract. In a word, they were old and they wouldn't normally have grabbed the headlines. Many victims were in their late 80s or even older. Some were reluctant to report the attacks through embarrassment or shame or for some other reason. Some, because of their age, were confused about what had happened to them, didn't really understand, and found it difficult to explain not only to the police but also to their families. Of course, they were chosen by the Night Stalker for their vulnerability. And given all that, it wasn't an easy investigation for the police.
The impact was really deep. I mean, fear penetrated through communities, and for his victims themselves, the lives they lived afterwards were also ones of fear. You know, stories of people being awake all night because they were frightened in the darkness. He really did terrorise communities, didn't he?
Many elderly people and their families and friends, of course, spent years fearing that they would be next. And they couldn't understand for a long time why it was taking the police so long to identify the rapist.
In 2009, the police approach shifted, and that was down to our guest, former Detective Chief Inspector Colin Sutton. Colin comes from a family of policemen. He spent 30 years in the police himself, many of them leading high-profile investigations. Of the 37 murder cases he investigated, he solved 35 with convictions. Colin, welcome to True Criminals, and what an impressive record.
Still lost 2, but there we go.
I knew the 2 are probably the ones that you lie awake in bed thinking about, are
Certainly
they?
one of them is, because I think it was a slightly bizarre verdict by a jury, but there we go, that happens sometimes.
Well, we're here to talk about one of your big successes, Colin. You were brought in to review Operation Minstead in 2009 after years of frustration and also a spike of 16 new offences in early 2009. What state was the investigation in when you took it over?
It was difficult really to gauge. I mean, there were too few people trying to chase too many offences at the time. And they were dealing with each offence as if it were a murder investigation because they were all murder detectives, effectively. You know, the command was known as the Homicide and Serious Crime Command, and you often forgot that serious crime bit, but something like this, a series of rapes, particularly these nasty rapes on old people in their old homes. You know, it was a horrible, really, really kind of wicked offences. And so quite rightly it went to the murder squad, if you like. But they kind of had a mindset that everything had to be investigated like a murder, which means that full house-to-house inquiries done in the locality, full forensic examination of the scene, phone records, CCTV, all the stuff, all the tools that were being used in the early 2000s to solve murder investigations.
But there was a big clue. You had DNA.
We did have DNA. He'd been, our suspect, as we didn't know who he was then, had taken great pains always to avoid leaving his fingerprints. The thinking was, and it was true, that his fingerprints were probably on file. He probably had a history of convictions and they were on file. So he knew that, but he also knew we didn't have his DNA. And so he wasn't that fussy about leaving his DNA, even in silly things like drinking from vessels and cans of beer and orange juice cartons and things in the premises, leaving his DNA there.
He also didn't wear a condom. So there was a DNA source there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, he left his DNA at a number, around about a dozen different offences, I think. And unless and until he was on that database somehow, he was safe. And the problem with these offences or these cases where you have DNA and you don't know whose it is that the standard way of reacting to them is what's known as a mass screening or mass swabbing operation, where basically you use the best intelligence you can have, in both senses of the word, brain power and information, to come up with a list of people, with a pool of people that you think contains your suspect. And then you go around to them one by one, can we have your DNA, please? Problems with that are, first, it's voluntary, so people can say no. And of course, every time somebody says no, you think, could that be our man then? And that dictates a lot more work to look into that person. But the real problem with it is that no matter how good the intelligence is and how bright the people are and how well this pool is constructed, there is no guarantee that your suspect is in there. You're hoping that he's in there. And if he isn't, you do all that work and you still haven't found him.
So you come in and you see how the operation's been working. What was your approach? How did you change things up, Colin?
Well, it was... I went to a meeting, an office meeting of the supervisors. It went on for 3 hours and everybody talked about DNA the whole time. And I wrote in the margin of my big red notebook, what if we didn't have the DNA? And it was just an aid memoir to myself later on to think about and think, okay, well, how would we be doing this if we didn't have the DNA? And when I did reflect on it and thought about, is there something we can do differently? Because that was my brief, was to go over there, just think, is there anything that's been missed? Is there anything? Now, there's no way I can go there in a matter of weeks and go through 17 years worth of investigation, say, hang on, there's one here in this case in 2001. It was going to be a more sort of process/strategic kind of thing that I could come across. And this, what if we didn't have the DNA, was kind of the key to it, because I thought, well, what have we actually got here? If we didn't have the DNA, how would we be doing this? And that was then the realization that we were treating this man purely as a sex offender. He wasn't a sex offender all the time. Many of his offences were there was no rape. There was some of them wasn't even any indecent assault. He would just burgle, steal a few bits and talk to the victim. But every single offence was a burglary. Every offence started with a burglar. So you think, well, how do you solve burglaries? Well, burglary tends to be a local crime. It's a parochial thing. People burgle close to where they live or to keep to a certain area. And what traditionally would happen is you'd have an uptick in burglaries in that area, and you'd get some officers and you'd do a bit of an observation and stop people and catch somebody in the act and sort it. So can we do that? Well, the problem is that we've got the small area here is a quarter of London, because effectively that's where he was working. It was everything kind of east of the A23 and south of the river that was in Greater London was where he was working. And there aren't enough police officers in the whole of the country, let alone just London, to lock that down. So you had to be a bit more creative and a bit more intelligent. You had to use crime pattern analysis to say, where did he mostly operate?
I imagine that the morale of the detective team you inherited must have been pretty low at this stage. And there's this new senior investigating officer coming in suggesting that perhaps they've been doing things wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, how did you manage that?
It's a tough gig. I didn't manage it. I just got on with it, to be absolutely honest. The good thing about it for me was it was a quarter of London in which I had never worked before. I'd worked in the east, north of the river. I'd worked in the west. I'd worked in the middle. I'd never worked southeast. And that meant I didn't know anybody there. And so I thought about it and thought, well, I can afford to tread on people's toes. Actually, I don't know who they are and they won't know what to expect from me anyway. So I just went in and did what I could and said it as I saw it, I suppose. The team were kind of 50-50 split. Some of them were there because it was less hard than investigating murders, to be honest. And the others were there because they didn't want to be there. They wanted to be on a murder squad and they wanted to solve it so they could get to a murder squad. They were the ones that were helpful. Unfortunately, the DI that was there, Nathan, was just top man, and he was sort of helpful. They wanted to change the approach. They wanted to do something, and we were just reacting to everything, and we were just behind him all the time. And there was a real sort of turning point. It was one Saturday in I think it was late May in 2009, and we'd gone to an offence. The victim was suffering from dementia. She couldn't really tell us anything about what was going on. We were doing the house inquiries. We were doing all the normal stuff, and I'm there with Nathan. I just said, how long are we going to keep doing this? You know, we're just keeping on. We can do another 17 years of this and still not catch him. And it kind of crystallised the fact we need to get in front of him. We need to be there waiting for him and see him do it. And that's how we can get there. So let's forget about the sex crimes. Let's just say he's a burglar. How do we catch a burglar? Let's find where he might offend. And we'll sit there. We know he's busy at the moment. 16 offences in the start of 2009.
You'd already said that South East London, of course, was a big patch for you to look at if you're waiting for him to strike again. But in your book, Colin, you describe how you tried to put yourself in the Night Stalker's shoes and get into his psychology a bit and what he might be thinking. How did that help you? I
think that's really the greatest skill or art that a detective has, is being able to predict what people do. What would somebody do in this situation? It's about understanding people, the whole thing, not just for this case, but for murders as well. I mean, I'm a great adherent of this idea of geographical profiling that, again, I talk about quite often. And he obviously had favourite areas where he felt comfortable offending. And one of those was close to his house, and the other one was somewhere where he'd worked, as it turned out. And if you add that together with the evidence of where the offences were taking place and the clusters, you're going to say, well, okay, if he's there, that's where he's likely to come back to. And that was why when we did the observation, the very first night, he committed 3 offences, 2 offences and an attempt that were literally yards outside the area we were looking at, 2 up at the north of it and 1 across to the east of it. And I'm generally a glass half full sort of person anyway. And I said, no, we're in the right area. He's come back here. That's where he's happy. Then the second night he did one right up in Lambeth, the furthest north and I think west that he ever offended. And that was the one where he was chased by a uniform officer for like 2 minutes and miles, 5 minutes, I don't know. He was literally 10 seconds behind him. He was very, very nearly caught. And again, people say, well, that's it. That will frighten him. He won't offend for weeks now. He'll think that was too close. And I said, no, what it will do, it will drive him back to where he feels comfortable. He'll drive him back to us. And of course, that is eventually 2 weeks later what happened.
Before we get to that, can I just ask about how important was it for you at the back of your mind that even if you find your suspect and you get him to court, how good are your witnesses going to be if he denies everything? Because the victims are old. They're
Many of
probably,
them.
well, some of them were ill, dementia, Parkinson's disease, maybe vague about their recollection, embarrassed. I remember Simon Morgan saying that most of the victims were from a generation that tends to see the best in people. So as a pool of potential witnesses in court, you were up against it, weren't you?
Well, there are a number of things here. First is that I was involved many years ago up in the northeast of London in something called Operation Worker, which was about distraction burglaries on the elderly. And those elderly people were actually much better witnesses than people gave them credit for. And the thing was, I was a uniform inspector, I did a lot of the identification parades for it. And they just remember different things. If you get an old person, probably me now, I'm an old person.
Or me, I didn't mean to be disrespectful.
I'm keeping quiet.
To old people as I've joined their ranks.
What they would notice would be hair colour, build, eye colour. If you get a young witness, they'll notice it was an Adidas top, it was Nike trainers, it was a whatever watch. They notice different things. They're just as good. They just have a different view of what makes the person. And that's, I think, a really interesting distinction. So there was that. 2, with Minstead, we had DNA. It didn't really matter because as soon as we got the right person with his DNA, he was potted anyway. And thirdly, a lot of the witnesses were dead. And so their statements get read. But tactically, it's a really bad look for the defence to be dragging elderly people suffering from dementia with carers and everything through the witness box and cross-examining them to within an inch of their life, because what these witnesses had to say wasn't controversial. It wasn't going to be attacked. And so in the event, that really is what happened. All those statements were read anyway. The defence, because if you're looking at it from the point of view of defence counsel, all that does is make your client look worse in front of the jury because you're actually getting to see what these poor victims look like. You're actually better off just having it read because then they don't get to see it. So put all those things together, it wasn't, I didn't really have any problems about what was going to happen at court. It was just a matter of finding out who it was.
So I was completely wrong. That's why I became a reporter and not a detective.
You're wrong, Martin.
There's still time for you,
I think it's a fair question to ask. And I think the interesting thing is that that's not the answer you'd expect. But actually, it wasn't an issue.
What I'm struggling to imagine is the operation that you mounted, because you're in a big area. You're hoping that he's going to strike where you are. What does this operation look like? Is it officers in vans or cars?
Yeah, that's a really good point. That had been done before, but to a man and a woman sitting pretending to be a courting couple in a Vauxhall Astra with no hubcaps was going to not be clever enough to catch Minstead man. That was the problem. And I was fortunate when I went out of the Met for 6 years. The first 4 of those I really enjoyed. I was in West Yorkshire Police and I worked in Bradford, and then I worked at their headquarters and I was head of force intelligence, which meant I had surveillance teams and technical support and all the sort of stuff, and gained a knowledge that was really helpful to me when I then came back to London and was doing murders. But I had some really good surveillance people on that team who'd done it at a high level, National Crime Squad, Regional Crime Squad sort of level. And one of them, Graham, his name was, he said to me, Clitheroe, that's it, Graham Clitheroe. Everyone called him Jimmy, obviously. But he said to me once we were doing so, he said, they've got to know, boss, nothing's changed. Not know we're there, not any trace that we've been there. And I took that to heart. And I had a lot of help from the experts in the Met as well. And so rather than the vans or the couple in a car or people walking about or anything like that, what we actually had were people in disused buildings. We had people in a church spire. We had people all over the place trying to see what was going on. And they were just brief. You don't even drop a piece of paper where it shouldn't be. He cannot know that he's there, that we're there, because this guy is too smart. He's avoided us for 17 years. This is a big push we're having now. We're going to spend hundreds of thousands of pounds on this. We can't mess it up by a mistake. And the interesting thing about it as well, I think, is that if we'd have then had a team to go in and do stops on suspects. So we're in Shirley, we're in East Croydon Borough, Shirley. It's a residential area, mostly of sort of 30s houses, relatively middle class-ish, I suppose. No real shops, no real attractions after dark. The demographic of the people who lived there was probably overwhelmingly white. So actually, a black man walking about after midnight is going to probably be unusual anyway. So the thinking is, okay, well, we're going to want to stop people. Problem with that is, by the time we stop the second one, it will be word on the street, old Bill are doing something in Shirley. 2 of us have been stopped there. So we couldn't even stop our suspects there. And the way we dealt with that was that we had a surveillance team, a mobile surveillance team on standby. This is why it's costing so much. And when somebody was seen who needed to be stopped, he's followed by the static observation till he goes outside the area. Then the mobile surveillance team takes over and takes him as far away as they can from that plot before they stop him. And that way, nobody knows what's going on down here. And that was how Delroy Grant was stopped in. Delroy Grant was actually stopped about 3.5 miles away from where he tried to commit an offence.
But did your team see him try and commit that offence?
No, we saw him. Saw his car parked when we started at 11 o'clock. His car was parked where it hadn't been for the previous 16 days. And then he came running back to it. I mean, actually, he'd removed a pane of glass from an old lady's bungalow kitchen window. Didn't actually go in. He got frightened by somebody walking past with a dog or something. And he ran back to his car and decided to abort. And that was where he was. But we knew by that time that this car was likely to be his because we'd got CCTV from the first night of the operation that showed the only vehicle going through at the time he must have driven through was a grey Vauxhall Zafira. And that's what turned up outside, literally opposite one of the observation points. When they came on at 11 o'clock, that car's not been there for the last 2 weeks. They tell everybody on the radio that there's a possibility it's our man's car. So, yeah, it was an amazing operation in many ways. We had use of this ultra high-tech control room in London, which is normally used for terrorism and kidnaps and things. And we were there until something more important happened, and then we'd have got kicked out. That was the problem. And there's a wonderful story about that, where I'm standing there one night looking and nothing's happening. After he got caught, chased and wasn't caught, nothing happened for 2 weeks. And it's about 10 days into that, and I'm standing drinking coffee looking up at these screens. We've got about 18 screens of CCTV that we're looking at, and radios and everything's going on. And this chief superintendent came over and said, "How long are we going to do this for, Colin?" And I said, "Till somebody's got the balls to call it off the night before an old lady gets murdered." And he said, walked away and never saw him again. So
there was one of the other clues, I think, that helped enormously was his use of ATMs. And I read a story about how you had a potential suspect at an ATM at night. You couldn't see his face, but and I'm not sure whether at that stage you'd identified the possibility of the Vauxhall Zafira, but somebody saw an image in the bus that passed, reflected in the bus window that showed a Zafira. Does that ring any bells with you? A car reflected in the window of a passing bus.
Wow. Yeah, that rings some dusty old bells with me as well, actually, Martin. But because we didn't know when we had these pictures of him at the ATM, we didn't know about the Zafira. But we were able to go back and find the Zafira by looking at CCTV around the time he was at the ATM. But of course, we hadn't bothered because we didn't know what vehicle he had before that. That may well be true. That does ring some bells with me. Yeah. I can't give you any more information on it because it's just something that it's amazing how you forget things.
Well, let's give credit to an eagle-eyed detective.
Yeah, absolutely. And they were. And I got all excited driving around the M25. I lived in Surrey near Leatherhead at the time, and I was driving around to Lewisham every day, and they said, he's used the ATM where the secret cameras are. I didn't even know there were any secret cameras at that point, but I'm all excited, get in. And we've got a man with a cagoule on done up to under his nose, and it could have been anybody, So it was a bit. So I said, right, we don't need any more pictures like that. What we need actually is to get hands on him. And we were trying to think of ways we could do it. And in the interim, the best way I thought we could do it was to put 4 officers in a car sitting opposite the ATM. And if somebody in the early hours came there that looked like it might be our suspect, jump on him,
How did he become your suspect in the first place?
Well, he didn't until we found him.
And so
we didn't know who it was until he was arrested running to the car.
But did you know he'd done something at that time? Had anybody seen him do anything?
No, it was just
arrested for curiosity of what are you doing?
Well, no, by that time we knew pretty for certain that our suspect was driving a silver or grey Vauxhall Zafira. That was part there. We knew the description of the suspect. That matched the man who ran and got into that car. So we took him away and stopped him.
So you hadn't seen him break in or anything like that. How do you feel when things like that happen, Colin? Because it's clear that you put your heart and soul into investigations. You were in bed fast asleep.
It was the first night. It was the first night of the 17 nights I hadn't been there.
17 nights you did in a row.
And my day job as well.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, and Nathan had been on a course, which was why I was doing that. And he came back, he finished the course on a Friday and he phoned me and said, I don't have to come back to work till Monday. I've got the weekend off, but you've had a bit of a rough time of it. I'll do the weekend. That Saturday night was the night it happened. I was at home watching England play Brazil. And
so what was the phone call
drinking whiskey. It was interesting because it was about 1:30 in the morning and Nathan said, hello, Colin, it's Nathan. Oh, hello, mate. What can I do for you? I'm thinking, I'm just woken up. He said, great understatement. He said, I think we've got him. And there was a beat, and I'm an idiot because I said, are you joking? And he said, yeah, I thought I'd just give you a ring at 1:30 just to wind you up, which was really funny. And then the funny thing was, my then wife was head of intelligence in Surrey, Sussex Police at the time, I think. And I knew that Nathan had been on his SIO's course that week, or those last 2 weeks, and they tell you that when you get rung up in the middle of the night, assess who's on duty already. Do you need to go in or is it better to spread the command? So there's me and there's a DI. The DI is already there. So what the book says I should do is say, okay, I'll come and relieve you at 8 a.m. So that's what I said because he'd just been on the course. I thought that's what he'll be expecting. And he's like, okay, okay, see you at 8 then. He was really surprised. And I put the phone down. Louis said to me, who are you trying to kid? I said, yeah, you're right. I got up, had a shower, went in, so we were both there. So, yeah, it was pretty amazing. And we got the DNA sample that we'd taken from him biked up to the database in Birmingham by a traffic biker. So we got the result as quickly as we could. We got the result about 4 p.m. on the Sunday afternoon that it was definitely him. I think we knew.
Did you realise then that he was responsible for a whole load of attacks once you got that DNA sample? Yeah,
the interesting thing about how the DNA works is, and I'm not, my middle name was no forensics. I very rarely got any decent forensic evidence in any of my cases, but there were, as I said, I think 11 or 12 where he'd left DNA, but he was a creature of habit. He'd used the same screwdriver to force the windows open all through his career. So remarkable that somebody can keep a screwdriver for 17 years, but there we go. And that made individual marks because microscopically, as the screwdriver wears, it's like a fingerprint almost. When it's used to jemmy out the beading around the windows, which is how we got in, the beading sort of lead, it's quite soft, and it would take the imprint of the screwdriver. And so where you had DNA plus a screwdriver mark, kind of the DNA almost got propagated to offences where there was no DNA, but there was a screwdriver mark because it's only 1 degree removed. And that was how we kind of broadened the net, and we got to 29 offences that we were able to charge him with that were all, stone bonker going to happen because there was DNA and screwdriver or just DNA or just screwdriver. And the interesting thing about this that I haven't really talked about before was that, do you remember when John Warboys, the
Black cab
rapist, when he was about to be released on parole because he'd only been charged with a specimen number of offences. I'd like to say I saw that coming, and I didn't. I didn't know that's what they'd done in that case. But my point with the CPS on this was that we need to charge as many offences as we can so that when he stands there in front of that judge to be sentenced, he knows exactly the depth and the breadth of this man's offending and the scale of his offending. Because if you just put 5 offences there, he'll get charged for 5 offences. But actually, we think he's responsible for at least 200, probably 500. And we need to get that before the judge. And so that's why he was charged with this overkill, if you like, of 29 offences. Well, of course, then when Warboys almost gets parole, I think I'm really glad we did that, because we saw that off at the pass. There was no way he was only going to get charged with a specimen number of offences. So he didn't get whole life tariff, because you get sentenced according to the law as it stood at the time he committed the offences, and these were all older offences before whole life tariffs. But he got 27 years, I think, or 29 years, 27 years. I think he'll be 81 or 82 before he can apply for parole. So.
Hello and welcome to True Criminals. As you may have noticed, our podcast is now available on YouTube in full video format.
If you enjoy the show and want to help us grow, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you never miss a new episode. You can also leave a comment and join the conversation around the topics we cover.
You can also support the show by becoming a Patreon member.
We have 2 membership options available. Our ad-free tier lets you listen completely uninterrupted, and if you stay with us for 3 months, you'll receive an exclusive True Criminals mug as a thank you. Or you can become a True Criminals Insider, where you'll get our ad-free and extended episodes, including bonus material like the extended version of this episode. Just head over to patreon.com/True Criminals.
And now, Martin, back to the show.
I'm sorry to cast a slight shadow over your big night of the arrest, but we've got to ask this. One of the saddest parts of the story is the police error in 1999.
Yeah.
And I mean, clearly a time before your involvement in the case. But when you discovered that Delroy Grant's name had come up and the wrong Delroy Grant had been considered as a suspect, how did you feel when you found that?
I just felt desperately sorry for the 100+ victims that carried on after that. That was May 1999. He carried on for 10 years. There were at least 100, probably 200 more victims in that time.
Could you understand the error?
I understand how it happened, yeah. Like so many ills in policing these days, it was lack of proper supervision by first-line supervisors. The actual officer that made the error, I don't blame her one bit, because she was a trainee detective who was doing the job as best she could, and somebody should have been training her and should have been watching over her and not just signing it off without reading it, which is what I think happened. But the supervisor in question actually retired, where we're hearing this before any discipline or whatever could be done. But essentially, she made an assumption and never checked it. That's essentially the error, just a human error of making an assumption and not actually checking to make sure that assumption was correct. And the consequences that flowed from that were severe, because it didn't only mean that he wasn't arrested and charged and convicted in 1999, which he would have been because there was already DNA and he would have been convicted, but it also meant 2 things. It meant that on the 2 occasions when people after public appeals phoned the Minstead incident room and said, you need to look at Delroy Grant of 18 Brockley Mews, he was already on the computer as eliminated by DNA. So, of course, the first thing they do, they go to the computer, eliminated. Oh, don't need to bother with that. That happened twice. But even more sort of kind of stark is the fact that they were doing this mass screening, this very expensive, time-consuming, boring, mind-numbing mass screening operation, going around trying to get DNA, voluntary DNA from 30,000 black men aged between 35 and 65 in southeast London. He was never in the list, because why would he be in the pool to be swabbed when we think he's already been eliminated? So even if they'd have got round to every single one of those in the pool, they still wouldn't have found him. The only way that this crime would ever have been caught was him getting caught in the act.
When you look back and you think of all those hundreds of victims and what they each went through, humiliation, embarrassment, fear, everything, the people who survived his attacks. I don't even know where I'm actually really going with this, but I'm just trying to get my mind across the horror of what he did. Did you ever get to the bottom of what was driving him?
No, I'm no psychologist. He was brought up by his grandmother in Jamaica at a young age. And I'm sure there are people who are psychologists who will say, well, that's why I had this fixation with old women. It may be. I mean, I don't know. Maybe that's how it works. I don't actually care why he did it, to be absolutely honest, you know. I care about the people. I care about, particularly one lady, I called her Ellen after my late grandmother. In the book, that wasn't her name. She was 94 years old, and she's the one that hadn't told the family liaison, the two, Sam and Debbie, the most amazing human beings who were family liaison officers who dealt with these cases. And they'd been talking, and I'd said, even when we were doing Minstead Lights, so we weren't doing it like a full murder investigation, so we could do more. I said, if there's any chance, because one day he's going to kill somebody doing this, if there's any chance of somebody being so frail they're going to die as a result of what happened, we need to do it full scale again. And this was one. They phoned me up and said, yeah, get down here. She's a beautifully well-spoken lady. Her husband had been a bank manager or insurance manager when that meant something. They had this nice detached house. They hadn't had any work in it for 30 years since he died. And she was 94, and she sat in a rocking chair most of the day listening to Radio 4. And she'd crocheted herself some blankets. She said, if my back's too bad, I can't get up to bed, then I just pull the blankets up and I sleep here. And I got introduced to her, and the FLO said, Ellen, this is Mr. Sutton. He's the boss. And she said, Mr. Sutton. She put her hand out and said, call me Colin, Ellen. You know. And she pulled me down. I mean, she couldn't. She was 6 stone wringing wet. She was very frail. And she pulled me down, and I went with her, and she put her other hand on top of it. And she said, Colin, he interfered with me, you know. And I always say, people say, do you ever feel you'd lose your temper with these people you had to deal with? No, but that was the time, I think, if he'd have been standing next to me, I'd have throttled him at that point. I just felt so desperately sorry for her. And she'd not only suffered the victimization and she'd suffered the indignity in her views of having to talk to somebody about it. Why she chose me rather than these two lovely women, I don't know, but she did. She never ate again after that. She died 6 weeks later. And he killed her just as surely as if he'd shot her or stabbed her. But, old age was on the death certificate. The causation, the connection was too remote. And I had to try and explain that to her daughter, But, yeah, he killed her. As he killed others. He ended others' lives. They may have lived for a further period, but when you've lived in a house for 25 years and you're frightened to go back to it, do you know there were 2 of the victims that were still alive? When we arrested him, we knew it was him. We started ringing round, the FLOs did, to tell them. And 2 separately said, that's good, I can go back to being awake in the daytime now. These 2 old ladies had been doing night shifts ever since because they were so frightened of him coming back. They were sleeping during the daytime and staying up during the night. A
relative of my wife's lived in that area, Mottingham, somewhere around there. And I remember her at the height of this telling us that she had borrowed her son's air rifle and slept with it under her bed. Now, whether she'd have had the wherewithal or the opportunity to use it, but that was a sheer illustration of what people were going through.
Yeah, and again, there was this balance between causing fear and saying to the elderly, you need to lock your doors and windows, and actually being realistic as to what the risk was. And in certain areas, there was a severe risk. And you can go down any of these sort of 1930s suburban streets. If you go down them now, I can point out the ones where the old people live. Yeah, they're the ones where the front garden hasn't been flattened to take on 4 cars as kids grow up and get cars. They're the ones, obviously, with the rails outside. We've got a nice blue front door with little panes of glass at the top.
And net curtains.
Net curtains. Yeah, exactly. So it's not difficult. And we were coming up with so many sort of ideas about, one of the ideas we had was to get old people who lived in these houses buddied up with somebody to park their car on their drive, because he would think there was somebody there who was a driver, therefore it probably wouldn't be the old person, so they'd leave it alone. At the time he was arrested, I was talking to people at the sort of Clearing Banks Association or whatever it's called, BACS, but looking at the idea of whether we could voluntarily get old people to say that their debit card should be blocked between the hours of 9 a.m. and 9 p.m. or something like that, because he was having to use debit cards. The number of old people who gave him a duff PIN number was really reassuring. You know, that, by the time he gets there and finds out you'll be here, so I told him the wrong number. Brilliant. But that was he was having to use because, you know, his reign of terror spanned many changes, sort of social changes. And one of those was, rather than people having to go to get their state pension at the post office every Monday or Thursday, they were going straight into their bank account, which meant that they had debit cards rather than cash, and he had to use those to steal their money. The other one was where he was cutting phone lines at the start. People started getting mobile phones and cordless handsets. So he was finding those and putting them up on top of a cupboard or a wardrobe so they couldn't reach them. So he had to modify, it went on for so long, he had to modify his techniques, if you like, to cope with what he was presented with.
And was the trial a slam dunk? I know that's probably not the right phrase.
Probably because I had DNA, but I didn't go.
You didn't go?
I'd retired by then.
Had you retired? So you just followed it in the news, presumably?
He was banged to rights, but he came up with a bizarre difference.
He had, I mean, I say this, I did this in my show because it's just like, I say it's the number one all-time comedy criminal defence heard in the British court, I believe, because essentially what he said was that in 1979, when his first wife and he were having difficulties, she managed somehow to retain a significant quantity of his body fluids, which she then gave to a friend of hers who worked at a hospital in South London. He froze them in the lab. And then in 1992, she got them out, defrosted them, gave them to another male friend who she paid to go round and break into old ladies' houses and squirt this body fluid over them. That was his defence, essentially. And what worried me for many years was he was convicted on a 10-2 majority, which told me that two of those jurors must have thought, yeah, it could have been, couldn't it? You know, that worried me because you think, well, how do you believe that? And the real answer to that came many years later when one of the team was retired and in a pub and he happened to bump into one of the jurors. And the juror said, no, there were two blokes in that jury who from the very start said, hate the police, don't trust the police, can't stand the police. They're always lying, they're always fitting people up. It's a not guilty from me. And they stuck to it all the way through.
That's incredible, isn't it?
It is, but I prefer that to believing that story, to be absolutely honest. Because, you know.
Any final thought before we wrap, Colin, when you think back to this story? Any other little gem that springs to mind? Because we're giving your memory a bit of a workout today.
Oh yeah, I'll tell a silly story actually. Something that happened here. But there's Martin certainly will know Paul Stevenson, who became the
very well Sir Paul Stevenson.
Sir Paul Stevenson became the Commissioner of the Met. I liked him as a man and as a commissioner.
We all did. He was a good media commissioner.
Yeah, I had a very checkered sort of couple of times with him. So I was at the Barley Mow, which you know, for the Crime Reporters Association Christmas party.
Have you been to as many parties upstairs there as I have?
Yeah. And I was there early with John Toomey, who was then the chair of the CRA. And John Yates, who was an assistant commissioner in the Met, who I knew, was there with this man and introduced me. Oh, this is Colin. He was the SIO who convicted Levi Belfield, because that's what I'd done at that time. And I said, I'm sorry, I don't know you, to this bespectacled man. He said, oh, I'm Paul Stevenson. I'm Deputy Commissioner. I said, oh, God, hello, sir. Nice to meet you. So that was the first meeting. Now, fast forward to when we've done Minstead, by which time he's the Commissioner. Nathan, the DI, and I had a conversation the day before about how it was rude if when you've got a phone call going and you get an incoming call, you say, sorry, I've got to go, I've got one coming in. Why is that more important? I hate people who do that. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. I'm driving home. Incidentally, Minstead man was arrested, not on my birthday, it was 3 days after, but on the day when the Sunday was my birthday dinner with my family and my parents and my kids and everything in my house. So
it's back to your birthday.
So I'm leaving at 4:00 to get back for that. And I'm driving around the M25 and I'm talking to Nathan on the phone, the mobile phone, on the car key. I get a call coming for a number I don't recognise. And I'm about to, and I said, no, Nathan, I've got a call coming. He said, but no. I said, we'll carry on talking. It's obviously, you're more important, whoever that is. And I carried on, finished the call with Nathan, called this number back, and without thinking said, hello, I'm sorry I couldn't come to you. I was on a much more important phone call. He goes, oh, hello, Colin, it's Paul Stevenson. No. And he was in the Punjab. He was at some conference in the Punjab and he phoned me to say, well done, good team. I think his comment was, it's one of the great days for the Met. Good. We'd finally caught that man.
Praise indeed.
Had a lot of time for him, even though that I was rude to him on both occasions, the first two occasions that I met him. But
I just wanted to ask you, Colin, that have you ever investigated or come across a criminal who led such a double life, because this was a man who was a predatory rapist, but to many people who knew him, he was a kind, caring, a carer for his disabled wife, friendly with his neighbours, did all sorts of jobs to help them out, used to go down to the British Legion and play dominoes with his mates. Talk about a double life.
Yeah, absolutely. And the big contrast of that with Levi Belfield, when we arrested Levi Belfield, those who knew him said, yeah, we always knew he was wrong and it was just a matter of time. Whereas people who knew Delroy, no, you've got the wrong man. You must have the wrong man. He's the life and soul of the party. He DJs they have like street parties in his cul-de-sac. He DJs there and does the barbecue for it. As you say, he cares for his wife who's got progressive multiple sclerosis and is virtually quadriplegic. He used to go out knocking on doors with her. She was Jehovah's Witness when, you must have the wrong man. He's lovely. It's not. And it is a stark contrast between his Jekyll and Hyde life. But the story that when I first spoke to him, I made a joke about cricket. I tried to break the ice. He was dressed all in white, and I thought, West Indian man in his 50s probably likes cricket. I said, what are you doing, batting or bowling? And he said, you into cricket? I said, yes, I am. He said, do you still play? I said, yeah, I do a bit. Yeah. He said, oh, bat or bowl? I said, I can only bat these days because the old knees are too bad to bowl. Oh, I still do both. I said, oh, good for you. He's older than me. And he said, what do you think about the England team, the squad they're taking to South Africa this winter? I said, well, I think we could do another fast bowler on those hard pitches, but I think we go, yeah, I was telling the lads, we're having this, it's 3:00 in the morning, it's in the charge room, custody suite at Lewisham Police Station. He's in his white paper suit. He's just been swabbed. He knows he's going to prison forever. And I couldn't rationalise that at the time, how somebody would have such a humdrum, just like two blokes in a bar, Now I realise I was getting the good Delroy. I was getting the Delroy that all these people knew, who was the life and soul of the party, nice bloke. And he was using that on me at the time.
Is that hard for you? Because I see why you do that kind of thing. You're trying to break the ice. You're trying to get some kind of rapport, because if you've got a rapport, then hopefully he'll talk to you. But is it quite hard for you in your mind to separate yourself from the crimes you're pretty sure he's done? Or is that just part of being a detective?
You're playing a role.
Yeah.
You're playing a role. You have to put to the back of your mind what you actually think of him. And people again ask me that, why don't you, why don't you just start? I said, look, whatever you do, if you're a plumber, if you work in a shop, if you're a journalist, whatever, people will piss you off at work. But you're professional enough to think, well, I can't do that because I'll get the sack if I say what I think or do what I think. It's only that. And actually, it's actually doubly worse. It's not just you'll get the sack, but that person stands a chance of getting off of whatever they've done if you do things wrong with them. So you're just professional. You just do it. You're playing a role.
Wow. I could sit and talk to you all day, Colin.
It's been as enlightening as it always is talking to you. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much, Colin.
I'm pleased to be your first visual guest. I think you could have picked somebody better looking to be your first visual guest, but there we go.
I don't think we could have done. You're much better looking than Martin today with all his injuries.
You don't look like you've just been beaten up like I do. So you're the perfect first guest for telly.
Thank you. Well, it's been a pleasure. I absolutely enjoyed seeing you again, meeting you. And again, we've talked about things that not everyone talks about. So I always think, I've done this to death. Actually, we haven't. There's so much to these stories.
Martin, one of the things I found most fascinating listening to Colin was how he took a very different approach and mounted this incredible surveillance operation, and the hours and hours that went in with huge operation costing a fortune, of people watching and waiting in all kinds of different locations, and then discovering that missed opportunity back in 1999.
This is a shining example of how policing is vulnerable to human error. But equally is capable of human perseverance to get the right result in the end. The same organisation can fail spectacularly and still eventually, with the right kind of leadership, put the right people in the right place to catch a predator. Colin took over this investigation at a time of very low morale, years of not finding this predator. And I always remember halfway through those many years that this case remained unsolved, the police went to Trinidad. A small team of detectives went to Trinidad, where they were hoping to extend that database of DNA that they'd spent a long time compiling. And I don't know how successful they were in that, but what everybody remembers from that trip was that the Mail on Sunday put an undercover reporter into the hotel who sat there incognito observing the detectives over 2 or 3 days and taking photographs. And what the report, front page report, showed, I think it was front page, the next week were the detectives sitting around in their shorts and T-shirts around the pool, enjoying barbecues, beers in their hand, with the headline, "The Frying Squad." So you can imagine how damaging that must have been to the morale of those cops, who doubtless were doing a lot of good work while they were there. But, as we've often said, a picture tells 1,000 stories. And the implication was that they were there on a bit of a jolly. Now, they might have been, but, the lasting impression was that this was a failing team of detectives who, even after their failure, were still flying off to the Caribbean and having a good time.
And just an example of the complicated relationship that Colin talked about between, journalists and detectives, when, as we know, when it works well, it works brilliantly. And then when it doesn't work well, when something like that happens, or he's put under pressure by a newspaper to push forward in an investigation, beyond the time when they're ready, it can be very damaging. I think as well, the truth perhaps of the Night Stalker is that sometimes the most frightening of criminals aren't always brilliant, but can be persistent, like this one was, and exploit, the weaknesses and cracks in the system, and perhaps thinking around the DNA database.
Yes, in the end, the police had to try a whole new tack. And eventually those cracks you talk about did close, and Delroy Grant was convicted and sentenced to spend not his whole life in jail, but a good many years. And it may be that even when he does get a chance to ask for parole, there's no guarantee that he'll get it, and perhaps essentially he will spend the rest of his life in prison.
Welcome to our new Patreon followers. Thank you for joining. Just to remind listeners, if you want to hear the episodes ad-free, you can. Head over to patreon.com/True Criminals. Stay with us for 3 months at Patreon and we'll send you a free True Criminals mug. Your support means everything to us. If you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to leave us a review. It helps us grow, reach new listeners, and keep bringing you the stories you love. This episode is brought to you by Audio Bleach Global. Follow True Criminals on Instagram @true.criminals and on YouTube at youtube.com/@true-criminals. For exclusive content and ways to support the show, visit us at patreon.com/True Criminals. For partnership opportunities, please contact us at contact@audiobleachglobal.com.